For the past year, I've had the opportunity to curate 2 exhibits using archival collections and artifacts that are held by the Rauh Jewish Archives here at the Heinz History Center. While it's common for archivists and librarians at the Heinz History Center to assist our curatorial partners, it's rare for an exhibit to emerge from the archives. In part, that's a choice. The essential work of curating an exhibit can be uncomfortable for archivists, especially these 2 tasks: highlighting some materials over others, and then situating that selection of materials within the context of a specific story. I certainly felt out of place. Archivists care for materials so that people can use them. We watch the world use the materials in our collections in many different ways: academic papers, school projects, family histories, art, advocacy, books, documentaries, websites, exhibits, and even social media posts. We're happy when people use the materials in our care. And yet we also have a private relationship to these materials. And this comes from the hours spent appraising and rehousing, arranging, describing, and reviewing each item in each collection individually. From this premise, I want to share some reflections that I've had on curating as an archivist. First, I want to share a little bit about these 2 exhibits. The first exhibit is Louise Silk, A Patchwork Life. This exhibit is currently on display in the Behrensfeld Gallery, which is at the other end of the 5th floor. Using many examples from her work, as well as materials from her papers, the exhibit illuminates the relationship between her personal life and her artistic career, and it places the different phases of her career into a historical context. The second exhibit is called Backstitches, The Art of Barbara Trellis, which recently closed at the Road of Sholem Art Gallery in Shadyside. It presented a behind-the-scenes look at about a dozen of the art and ritual objects that Trellis made for Jewish congregations throughout the area. These 2 projects had a lot in common. The first is that they had similar subjects. Each of these exhibits looked at the career of an individual Jewish woman who had used her Jewish identity as the centerpiece of an entrepreneurial fiber arts career based in Pittsburgh. These women were contemporaries locally, although they were born about a generation apart. Trellis was born in 1930. She began needlepointing in the 1950s, became a popular instructor in Pittsburgh in the 1970s, and then oversaw a series of major commissions between the 1980s and the early 2000s. Silk was born in 1950, discovered quilting in the early 1970s, and has been a prolific and forward-thinking presence in the local and national art world since the late 1970s. Both of these exhibits were possible thanks to archival collections that had been preserved by the artists. This is not always the case. Some of you may recall an exhibit here at the Heinz History Center a few years ago on the beloved Pittsburgh artist John Kane. In that case, the artist himself had preserved almost no archival material documenting his own career, and so the curators here had to cleverly assemble the exhibit using other sources. In my case, the opposite was true. Silk and Trellis both created and preserved significant documentation of their work. And for both, I had the opportunity to review that archival material with the artists themselves before working on the exhibits. In both cases, this experience had a heightened, almost sacred quality to it. Louise and I met over a series of weeks in 2023. And during each visit, we went through 1 box of her materials. As we reviewed each box item by item, she would explain the significance of the different pieces and the stories behind them. And then at the end of each session, I would leave with that 1 box, slowly transferring the collection to the archive. I want to share just 1 example. Throughout the 1980s, Louise was trying to find ways to expand the quilting vocabulary to accommodate ideas from the world of fine art. She pioneered a style of tubular quilt that allowed for many new designs. These tubes, she explained during one of our meetings, were partly inspired by this clipping on the left from an art magazine, showing a reproduction of a work of 2-dimensional modern art. The anecdote beautifully illustrates the fertile mind of the artist, how everything can become inspiration. But keeping the original clipping represents an understanding by that artist that the key moments of her artistic development had permanent worth. It's hard to convey in an exhibit the way that this simple clipping glows in its original setting. Barbara Trellis and I met only once. A mutual friend, who's actually here today, had persuaded Trellis to show me a pair of scrapbooks documenting Trellis's career. These were meticulous and orderly scrapbooks. Each began with an index of projects and proceeded chronologically with tabs marking each project. Each project was given a series of pages where Trellis narrated her artistic process, how she had received each commission, how she had analyzed the creative challenge inherent in that commission, and how she had implemented her vision. Each page had photographs, sketches, and work samples. In the sitting room of her apartment, we reviewed each of these scrapbooks page by page together. And then she walked me through her apartment and she showed me many examples of her personal and private works. At the end of my visit, I left with nothing. She declined to donate the scrapbooks, but she hinted that the archive could have them after she passed. And in fact, shortly after she passed last year, her children donated these scrapbooks to the archive. No exhibit could ever adequately convey the feeling I had reviewing these scrapbooks with the artist who had so lovingly created them. The room was filled with the pleasure she took watching a stranger enjoy her work and her efforts to document her work. Reviewing a collection with its creator is a special experience reserved mostly for archivists. But once the material comes to the archive, they are reviewed in even greater depth through the act of processing the materials. And here, new insights emerge. Exhibits generate meaning from sensory experiences. You learn things at an exhibit by looking at objects or by listening to a recorded voice, or occasionally even touching special materials. I've never personally encountered an exhibit that was based on smelling or tasting, but I presume that somebody has tried that at some point. Archival collections generate meaning differently, often using the space between objects. For example, one of the most incredible parts of Louise's collection are a series of notebooks she kept through the 80s, 90s, and into the early 20th century. These notebooks include sketches, notes of meetings, and even personal journal entries. Notebooks such as these actually work quite well in exhibits. You can just imagine the power of pairing a sketch from one of the notebooks with the actual finished quilt. And yet we could never quite make it work. We could never find the right page with the right quilt that matched the available space in the exhibit and also maintain the existing story arc of the exhibit. Perhaps it was possible, but not within the hectic rush of our curatorial schedule. Even so, displaying one of these notebooks in an exhibit would have meant choosing one page, and you really cannot get a sense of the passage of time just by looking at one page. For example, one of the notebooks covers the years 1986 to 1993. These were highly consequential years for Louise. She had her first one-person exhibit in 1987. It was an attempt to push the visual and aesthetic boundaries of quilting. Feeling unsatisfied following that exhibit, she made a significant change, deciding she would instead make art from her personal experiences and specifically her Jewish identity. This was the subject of her second one-person exhibit in 1994. So this one notebook covers that entire creative evolution. In one page, she writes, quote, in one page documenting the first one-person exhibit in 1987, she writes, quote, I'm thinking about exposing myself to others like this, showing everything I've got, and really it's not good enough. I feel like I've got such a long way to go in this to be anywhere at all. And then in another from several years later, you see this handwritten prayer that she's written that blesses handcraft. Only by sitting in the archive, taking this notebook at its own pace, flipping through it page after page after page, does the full significance of this artistic struggle unfold. To try and summarize it through storytelling is like trying to take a photograph of an eclipse. In creating Barbara's exhibit, I found something similar. In choosing images from her scrapbooks, I was forced to summarize the story she had told about herself. Her story was articulate and concise, but it was not quite concise enough for audiences who would be standing in a gallery, reading from panels. And so instead of absorbing her story from her, viewers get her story mediated through me. I want to conclude with one other way that meaning is found in archival collections that can be hard to translate into an exhibit. It has to do with a concept called arrangement. Arrangement is essential to the archival process. To use the definition provided by the Society of American Archivists, arrangement is the organization and sequence of items in a collection. Arrangement often requires a balance. You want the collection to be comprehensible and useful to the researcher without losing too much of the meaning that might be embedded in the original arrangement. So if a person kept their records by subject, it might be unwise to rearrange those records chronologically. For both Louise Silk and Barbara Trellis, though, arrangement was not an issue. Both of these collections came to the archives exquisitely arranged by their creators. All we really had to do was transfer the materials in their current arrangement into our boxes and our folders. Some of this orderliness certainly reflects the mindset of the fiber artist. As I have come to learn about the world of quilters, needle pointers, and embroiderers, I've discovered that many value attentiveness and orderliness and organization. They like to have a clean, neat workstation with all their tools at the ready and their supplies well organized. But as I came to learn the story of these two artists specifically, I also came to believe that some of the orderliness of their archival collections reflected a sense of self-respect. By meticulously documenting their careers and by maintaining this documentation with care, they were taking themselves as seriously as they wanted the world to take them. The art world has its prejudices. It has often favored men over women, cosmopolitan over regional, secular over religious, and within the world of religious art, Christian over Jewish. Until very recently, it has favored painting and sculpture over fabric and thread. Aware of these prejudices, these two artists seem to understand that at some level, they would need to validate their own work before others would even consider validating it. One way they chose to validate their work was by keeping detailed documentation and preserving that documentation to share with a more accepting future. In creating these two exhibits, I hope to bring that future just a little bit closer, however imperfectly. Thank you.